Soften your stance or we'll take offensive measures. The warning from North Korea to the US over stalled nuclear talks. How will Washington respond? And what is the new approach Pyongyang says it's considering? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. North Korean leader Kim Jong UN has called for positive and offensive measures to protect the country's security and sovereignty. That's ahead of a year-end deadline he set for the US to soften its position on stalled talks aimed at Pyongyang dismantling its nuclear and missile programs. Kim also warned during a ruling Workers' Party meeting that he may take an unspecified new path if Washington fails to act. US military commanders say that could include testing a long-range missile, something North Korea hasn't done since 2017. Rob McBride explains.
North Korean leader Kim Jong UN has over the past couple of days been chairing a special plenary session of the Workers' Party of Korea. There have not been too many details coming out about what's been discussed, apart from these vague, ominous references to new offensive measures being considered. But of course, this is all the build-up to Kim Jong-un's New Year's Day address, when he normally lays out the way ahead for his country for the coming year. And of course, it may give us an indication of what he means by this new path that he has threatened to take if the United States did not come back with concessions in the denuclearization talks by the end of 2019, which of course they haven't. There are fears that North Korea may go back to the testing of long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles that it was embarked on in 2017. That's in spite of warnings from the US not to embark on such provocations. But of course, North Korea did warn of some kind of Christmas surprise, which was taken as meaning that they were planning some kind of launch over the Christmas period. Well, Christmas has come and gone, and there's not been a launch of a longer range missile. So there is a speculation here that maybe the new path is not to go back to the long range missile testing of 2 years ago, maybe to continue short range missile testing so as not to endanger the possibility of some agreement with the US in the future, but more importantly, perhaps not to undo all of the work with North Korea's neighbors, in particular the Russians and the Chinese, who have been calling for some relief from sanctions for North Korea. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest then. We have joining us Victor Gao. He's Vice President at the Center for China and Globalisation think tank. He joins us by Skype from Beijing. Andrei Lankov, Director at NK News, an online news source focused on North Korea. He joins us from Seoul in South Korea. And Richard Weitz is a security analyst at the global risk consultancy Wikistrat. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you. If I could start perhaps with Victor in Beijing. So by calling for offensive measures, is Kim Jong-un basically signaling he's given up hope of the US softening its position?
Well, first of all, we should be satisfied that there has been substantive progress on the Korean Peninsula over the past 18 months or so, and this should give us encouragement and hope for
what substantive progress has there been, do you think, Victor? A lot of the analysts are saying there's been a lot of talk, but not a lot of actual substantive movement on any of the denuclearization
Well,
issues.
first of all, on the US side, there has been no major massive military exercise with ROK, as DPRK has demanded. And secondly, on the DPRK side, there has been no testing of the atomic weapons or hydrogen weapons or long-range ICBM, for example. This should be reasons for us to be happy about. However, on the other hand,
Sorry to jump in again, Victor, but isn't that basically what we're talking about is there hasn't been any further escalation. That doesn't mean there's actually been progress in denuclearization, does it?
No, denuclearization remains an unfulfilled goal, and it's still very much challenging. On the other hand, we also need to put this into perspective. That is, before this round of diplomatic hurry, the situation on the Korean Peninsula was almost on the brink of a major war, which would damage lots of interests, not only DPRK, ROK, but also neighboring countries, including the interests of the United States. On the other hand, I think the way the United States is dealing with the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula may be fundamentally flawed. No country or no head of state should take this daunting challenge as a walk in the woods. Nothing is easy in dealing with the DPRK's denuclearization, and I think it will require a lot of effort to pool resources of all the major countries, including China and Russia in particular, in order to really achieve denuclearization. And this denuclearization remains as daunting as it was 15 or 18 months ago, but I think through diplomacy and dialogue, we should have greater hope in the future. And confrontation, threatening, bluffing, etc., will achieve a counterproductive goal on the Korean Peninsula.
Let me take some of those points you've raised to Washington, D.C., where Richard Weitz is. And Victor didn't spell out the Trump administration there, but I suspect he had that in mind when he said no world leader should take it as a walk in the woods when it comes to negotiating the denuclearization of North Korea. Is there a sense, do you think, Richard, or is it justified to have a sense that perhaps the Trump administration underestimated the task?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, the people who have been presenting the administration's logic have said, well, you know, there's no good solution here. If we launch a military strike, we could have a war. If we do nothing, we'll end up with at least North Korea with nuclear weapons, perhaps Japan, South Korea, and other countries. We can rely on sanctions, and that I would add that has actually been one success of the administration's policy. The sanctions have increased, and including those imposed by China and Russia. The one unusual step President Trump took, which was against the recommendation of many think tank people, but
sorry, let me jump in if you don't mind and interrupt you too, Richard. But how is that a sign of the success of the Trump administration's policy? Is simply slapping on more sanctions success, as you see it?
Yes, because in the past, the sanctions on North Korea were weak and porous. There were a lot of complaints about whether China, Russia were fully implementing them. And insofar as there wasn't a lot of pressure on North Korea to come to the negotiating table, that was giving them a reason to just go ahead and develop their nuclear and missile potential.
But
what
isn't that exactly, sorry, Richard, but isn't that exactly the scenario we're looking at now, even with more sanctions on the table? It seems the North Korean leader is signaling he might be resuming some of those activities. Where's the success?
If you're looking ahead, then, I mean, I would say that there's been success in the past 2 years. Victor gave a couple reasons. I'm giving a couple more. You are right, though. We are now looking at a regression. We could see resumption of missile and nuclear tests, resumption of large-scale U.S. military exercises in the region. I remember a couple of years ago how terrible it was every time North Korea launched a long-range missile. The debate in Washington as well, should we attack them now or can we wait a bit? So it could very well go poorly, and that's why I'm glad we're talking about how to avoid that now.
All right, so at least one thing it seems both of our guests in Beijing and Washington, D.C. have in common is let's just be thankful things haven't escalated into a war and we're all alive. Let's bring in Andre from Seoul and ask the question, is that enough, do you think, at this point?
Yes, it's enough. Because I would like to be quite frank. Denuclearization is not going to happen. Never. I repeat. North Korea is a nuclear power. It has been nuclear power for 15 years. And it will remain nuclear as long as the Kim family stays in control, which might easily mean another 50 years or 70 years. We don't know. Under no situation.
So hang on, Andrei. Does that mean that these talks are ultimately doomed then? Because that is the point of the talks.
Yes, if you want denuclearization, it's not going to happen. Full stop. However, talks are still necessary, because it's time not to talk about denuclearization, which is not going to happen, but about arms control. It's not possible to persuade or blackmail or bribe the North Korean decision makers into surrendering their nuclear weapons, because they believe, with good reasons, that without nuclear weapons they are doomed, and they are probably right. So it's a question of life and death. They will not compromise, but it's probably possible, with the right combination of incentives, of pressure, to negotiate some kind of arms control deal. Our goal is not to achieve a non-nuclear North Korea, which is not going to happen, but our goal is to make a nuclear North Korea more predictable and less dangerous.
You used the word blackmail. Is North Korea being blackmailed? By who?
How else can you basically describe sanctions? It's normal. It's not any kind of moralistic judgment. It's how states have always dealt with one another, have dealt for centuries, for millennia. If you do this, I will either punish you or I will reward you. I would call it blackmail or bribing.
All right.
Maybe it's not too polite, but I think it's pretty good description.
Let me take those points back to Washington, D.C. Richard, what do you make of that? That attempting to blackmail North Korea is doomed. Perhaps the U.S. and its allies should be focusing on arms control measures.
Right. I would actually use the blackmail term with regard to North Korea. I think that's what the purpose of all these threats and hints of offensive action are, that, unless you relax the sanctions and make other concessions, we're going to go ahead and make these tests. That aside, I disagree that the answer is we're never going to see North Korea denuclearize. I can see scenarios in which it would occur. There was some hope that with the new North Korean leader, clearly very concerned about the health of his economy, eager to break out of isolation, more distant from China than the past, that there may be openings with him to consider some kind of grand bargain in which North Korea gave up nuclear weapons in return for economic. Not presently, but who knows? Maybe this will change in the future. I mean, there is one clear solution, which I think will be the solution, which is you have reunification of Korea into something that looks like big South Korea, and that country gives up nuclear weapons and gets security guarantees from Russia, China, and the U.S. And that's how we will solve this problem at some point. The problem is I don't know how we get there in the interim. So anything that buys us time, I'm not sure is bad. I mean, eventually we'll hopefully reach that solution, but I just can't say when. And it may well take decades.
I wonder how it's seen in Beijing. Of course, China is one of the few or last somewhat allies, I think we can say, of the Democratic Republic of North Korea, People's Republic of Korea. Do you think that the thinking in Beijing is developing along the lines that we heard Andrei talk about, that maybe it's time to move on from demands of denuclearization to something else?
With due respect, I disagree. Why? Because I think denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula must be achieved one way or another. That's the ultimate goal, and that's the goal set up by the United Nations. And the nuclear-armed DPRK will be a threat to its neighboring countries. And I don't think Russia or China will have any interest in seeing a nuclearized DPRK continuing so for many years. So I think First of all, let's agree that denuclearization is a must. It must be achieved one way or another. Secondly, we need to really understand why DPRK needs a nuclear weapon and what forces it into almost a corner to possess and develop the nuclear weapon. Whether there are things which can be done, especially by the United States, for example, in restructuring its relations with DPRK and also involving other major countries, including China and Russia, which can make DPRK feel more comfortable about its future, about its security, about, for example, giving up a nuclear weapon. That is the key. That is the grand
Like what
game.
measures? Let me
we need
stop
to
you there,
focus
Victor.
on.
What more measures should perhaps the US take or do from the perspective of Beijing to make North Korea feel more comfortable giving up its nuclear weapons? And how should it involve China more?
First of all, China has been involved over the past 2 years in the major initiatives in the United States. When Chairman Kim Jong Un flew to Singapore for the summit meeting with President Trump, he flew in the Air China special plane, for example. And when he met with President Kim in Vietnam, he traversed through China by a railway. And there are many other reasons. But I think the current way of trying to achieve a breakthrough purely between DPRK and the United States in a bilateral way is doomed to failure because DPRK will never fundamentally trust the strategic objective of the United States. It will always second guess if, for example, it gives up nuclear weapon, whether the United States will pounce upon DPRK and eliminate the regime, kill the leader, for example, and everything ends up in a disaster. In order to make sure that the security concern of DPRK can be addressed,
That's a
more
really good
forces will
point.
be involved.
Let me take that to Richard in Washington. Do you agree with that perhaps this should really be more of a multilateral approach rather than a bilateral one by the Trump administration?
I think it's understood that was going to be the process. I mean, even Russia and China in their peace plan laid out a path of initially you have a cessation of large-scale military activities by North Korea and the U.S. tied with South Korea. Then you have a series of bilateral talks, most importantly between the head of North Korea and the United States, but also involving the heads of Russia and China, and we've seen that occur in the past year, that open. And then the next final phase is to move to a multilateral framework, and I think that's the administration agrees with that. They're not enthusiastic about resuming the previous six-party talks, but there'll be some other kind of structure, certainly for an enduring peace agreement, certainly through the UN. We're still searching for an optimum approach, but I think that's understood that achieving an enduring nuclear-free Korean peninsula is going to require a critical support from Russia and China, as well as the United States, Japan, South Korea, and perhaps other players.
Let me bring Andre into the discussion. The North Korean leaders talking about perhaps pursuing a new path. What do we think that is?
Yeah. First of all, we have to understand what he wants. And he wants two things. First of all, he wants sanctions to be partially lifted. Sanctions, current sanctions, are very, very tough. North Korea can survive under such a pressure for years, but it cannot achieve economic growth. And it can survive only because Chinese government, sometimes in violation of the sanctions regime, is providing North Korea with food aid and fuel. Food aid is legal, fuel supply is not, but China is doing both. Having said that, so North Koreans need sanctions to be removed, at least partially, so the North Korean government will be able to resume economic growth. Because the first few years of the rule of the current North Korean leader were very successful. Contrary to the common misperception, North Korea, which is a very poor country, was growing quite fast. So it's their first goal. Second goal was to have some of tacit recognition as a nuclear power, because once again, all these talks about denuclearization, I have heard it for 20 years. I've been laughing at that for 20 years. Sorry for being a bit too impolite. Not going to happen. But actually North Korea wants to be recognized quietly, like, say, India or Pakistan or Israel as a nuclear power. And they understand that under President Trump, they have some chances to achieve this goal. They wanted to negotiate it. They did not succeed. So now they will try to follow their usual approach. They have done it many times in the past. If they face a problem, they create a crisis. They try to drive tensions high. They launch missiles.
So what do you think creating the crisis might be this time?
With bellicose rhetoric.
More long-range missiles, for example?
Short-range missiles, which have been mentioned, are not going to work. They have been doing it for the last few months. Americans are ignoring it. And they need something which will be noticed by the American domestic audience, by the American voters before the elections. They're essentially blackmailing Trump. Everybody is blackmailing everybody in this game. So they need something more impressive than just short or medium-range missiles. What can they do? First, satellite launch. They can essentially launch an intercontinental ballistic missile disguised as a satellite. They will tell it's not military, it's painted white. Basically, it's same technology, but they can claim it's satellite, peaceful satellite. Then they can have ICBM test. Finally, they can have a nuclear test. But according to what is known, China is deadly against nuclear tests, probably because they are so much dependent on legal and not so legal assistance from China. They will not dare
Andrei,
to
mentioned
challenge
this a couple of times.
Chinese
Just very briefly, what evidence do we have of illegal assistance from China?
Well, China is shipping a lot of stuff to Korea. Some of this stuff is not, some of the shipping is not violation of the UN Security
what evidence do we have?
Resolutions.
You explained that
Some
before.
of the shipping is violation. Well, we have stable fuel prices in Korea. In Korea, technically, Korea is basically North Korea is banned from buying new fuel, but fuel prices are absolutely stable.
All right.
Where does the fuel come from? No problem with fuel. No problem with grain. Trucks moving in night.
Let's pose that question to Victor Gao.
Trucks moving in night to the border.
Victor, is China? I'm sure you have something to say about the suggestion China is violating UN sanctions and shipping fuel. Is China doing that? And does it have a vested interest in just keeping the regime at least strong enough to achieve not only denuclearization, but some kind of downgrade of the US presence on the Korean Peninsula is surely also a Chinese goal?
Now, first of all, I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry's spokesperson has repeatedly reaffirmed that China has strictly and faithfully abided by the United Nations imposed economic sanctions against DPRK. And I have no reason to doubt the Chinese Foreign Ministry's statement. And according to my personal information, China has been very strict in abiding by such UN-imposed economic sanctions. Secondly, China has all the reasons and all the incentives to abide by the United Nations resolution. Why?
What about stability of fuel prices?
I agree that nuclear-armed DPRK is a major threat to peace and security in this part of the world, and we need to work together to achieve denuclearization of DPRK for a better Korean Peninsula.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks so much to our guests. It's been a really engaging discussion. Let's thank Victor, Andrei, and Richard. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.